In order to be able to do the best thing for patients, you have to avoid doing surgery on the wrong people. And you have to be able to fix any complication that you generate. And this is an area which has been underserved and underdeveloped. And part of it is the lack of diagnostics. And when I first saw the prototype of the MS39 in a booth about, I don't know, five or 6 years ago, Francesco put me in a little secret location. And I was just totally bowled over. Because for me, this was the beginning of the next chapter in refractive surgery. I personally was fine. I was better off than you, because I already had epithelial thickness mapping, because I invented an ultrasound system to do epithelial thickness mapping in 1991. Maria Clara was one of my LASIK teachers in 1996, 7 in Colombia, and I was using a prototype, and I've been measuring epithelium for 20 years. Okay, 20 years I've been measuring epithelium. Many of the older people in here will remember me always talking about this and always kind of being ignored. And so it's amazing that we now have a superbly accurate and well-designed diagnostic system that can enable anybody to do the right thing pre-op and understand post-op. And what I'm going to try and do is go over a little journey of the way that we use this device. And as of recently, just recently, I've been very proud to have been asked to be a consultant also for CSO, although I've really been working with Francesco for years now. So, as I say, you know, many people, how many times do you have these people say, they show you a topography and they go, what do I do? And you're like, well, give me more information, right? And to me, the most important piece of information after looking at a bad topography, the most important piece is what is the epithelial thickness profile. Absolutely. If you come to our therapeutics course later today, we have the live version. On Monday morning, we have the theoretical course. You will see that over a period of an hour and a half, we will talk in non-stop about the value and the power of seeing an epithelial map in understanding what is wrong in a cornea. Much more so than the topography. Much more so. Because the topography, as I will show you, is a representation of the epithelial smoothing function, not of the stromal surface. And so for me, one of the things that I decided to do, once the device was CE marked and commercialized, I immediately substituted all of my pentacams like that. We have 4 testing rooms, and I had a 5th unit, which is on my desk, on my own thing, and I put it next to my slit lamp, because whereas my forefathers would have had a Javal keratometer there, I now have, so, you know, we have the slit lamp here. This is the slit lamp of the 20th century, right? And Alfred Vogt wrote this beautiful textbook on it. Well, I now consider this to be the slit lamp of the 21st century, because this is the slit lamp that enables you to look at layered pachymetry and measure it and do a lot of incredible analytics. So the most important thing about the epithelial thickness profile is to understand what is normal, because it is not one layer that is 50 microns thick, which is what is in every textbook. Fortunately, over the last 10, 12 years, there's been a lot of OCT work that's duplicated the ultrasound work that we've done, and it's been shown that we can use epithelial thickness profiles to understand what is happening below the surface. So in keratoconus, and understand that I described this slide, I made it in 2004. So this is where we are now. 2004, I showed this slide first. And I said, look, in a normal cornea, you have a front surface, you have a Bowman surface, and you have a back surface. In between the first two surfaces is the epithelium. Now, in keratoconus, we know, because we know clinically for decades, that if a cone is very progressed, the epithelium breaks down over the cone. We know that because it's thinner. So we know that. We didn't need high-frequency ultrasound in 1991, and we don't need this. We knew that. So we knew that the epithelium would get thinner over the cone. But we didn't really know that it actually became thicker around the cone. We didn't know that. We do know it now. And so there's this donut configuration around anterior surface bulges. So the concept was that, and this came to me with one patient, and I remember her very well, where she had a very strange topography. And it didn't look like keratoconus, but I was bothered by it. And I said, well, let me look at the epithelium. And what she had was almost no change on the back surface. It was like maybe it's, I don't know, maybe it's a little bit strange back surface, but I'm not sure. But the front surface looked normal. And what I found was that the epithelial thickness profile was thinner directly above the region where the back surface was slightly abnormal. So this is the earliest phenotype of keratoconus, right? You have the cornea starting to bulge, but the front surface bulge is absorbed by epithelial remodeling around the bulge. So you don't see it on topography. And so this is the sort of situation where you remember, ectasia without a cause. Like, no, there is a cause, you just didn't find it, okay? And what transpired, I talked about this for many times in several meetings for a year or two, and I was kind of, he's like, yeah, whatever, it's such an effort to get an epithelial map with ultrasound. You're not going to do that on every patient, it's too much trouble. I'm like, too much trouble to avoid ectasia? That's too much trouble? Yes, it's too much trouble commercially. But when I showed that the epithelium can be thicker inferiorly, and the topography can look like keratoconus, and it is not keratoconus because you can prove that that inferior steepening is because of epithelial thickening, and that was in 2006. Suddenly, the RT view started to be produced by OptoView. They said, wow, this can make us money, because I published a paper which showed, and we screened 1,500 patients, and 10% of them had strangeness enough for me to go through the trouble of doing an epithelial map. And of those, we recuperated 83% of the eyes and did LASIK on them, even though the topography looked like keratoconus. So suddenly there was a commercial interest in measuring epithelium because it would increase your surgical volume. Now there's a reason for investing in an epithelial map. Now it became a commercial interest. Now how many OCT companies are now measuring epithelium? Okay? So it's interesting that the prevention of ectasia was not enough of a driver, but the increase in volume of your surgery was a good driver. And that's okay, it's business, I understand. So we had already studied, and you understand that by the time this epithelium OCT world started, I managed to publish with Tim Archer and my workers 40 papers on just the epithelium. So it was like a free, it's like there was nobody else in the room. So, for example, we had looked at keratoconus, and we knew that as the severity of keratoconus increases, the thinnest point over the cone becomes thinner, and the donut, the thicker part of the donut around the cone, becomes thicker. So this difference in this donut increases as the keratoconus becomes more severe. And we published, many of you should know now, this map that the epithelium is not one layer, one thickness in normals, and that it's related to eyelid dynamics. And that in keratoconus, well, it looks like a donut, right? And so the idea was, well, can we exploit this in the middle stage? So here's an example of a completely normal cornea in a hyperopic eye in a 37-year-old with 2012 best spectacle corrected vision and flat keratometry, right? Sounds good, right? And even better, the Bell and Ambrosio looks great. I mean, you know, maybe one parameter here, but it's a slightly thinner cornea, so okay. And the bad D was 0.61, it was totally normal, and no one would not do LASIK on this eye, except if you had seen the epithelial map. And so here's high-frequency ultrasound of this epithelium, and you can see that there's a donut, and it is on a pattern deviation map, which we now have on the MS39 in the keratoconus screening. On the pattern deviation map, you're comparing that eye to the population, and you're looking at how many standard deviations away, and that's a very sensitive way of looking at the difference between that map and the population. You can see the depression inferiorly, and it matches exactly where the back surface is also slightly abnormal. And catching these eyes is really fun, because you kind of see this disaster, this train wreck, which you almost went into, just disappear. Because you go like, you need an ICL. Why? Because if I do LASIK on your cornea, it won't be stable. Now, many of you know that we published in IOBS a machine learning tool that will classify an epithelial profile and have much more sensitivity and specificity for diagnosing keratoconus than any other device on its own. And now what we're doing is we're working together, all of us around the world, Renato, we're trying to get a multimodal approach to try and use all of the parameters so that we can have a much higher confidence in diagnosing preclinical keratoconus, because that's what we need to do, find preclinical keratoconus. So for years, in my clinic, it was a huge effort because I had to get a placido topography, I had to get a back surface from an ORB scan and a pentacam, and I had to get an epithelial map from a high-frequency ultrasound machine with an immersion scanning. And then suddenly, a few years ago, all three maps are now acquired in 1.5 seconds, and they're perfectly registered to each other on an incredible device called the MS39. And this is a game changer. It's a game changer. Total game changer. So, you see, the keratoconus screening on the P3, you know, the concordance of points and you know, it's great. But where's the epithelial map? Right? So what we do is we will look at this map and the epithelial map and correlate locations with the cursor. Now we have it, of course, this is now in the P4, where you can look at the epithelial map simultaneously to all the other maps. So here's an example of a regular low myope with a, you know, slightly warped cornea, possibly, and, you know, it looks relatively normal, right? And the Bell and Ambrosio, well, okay, you know, it's a thick cornea, so maybe it's some endothelial dysfunction. Do we do surgery or not? Well, I don't know until I look at the epithelial profile. And I want to point out that the standard settings that you get when you open the machine may not be ideal. You have to really play with the color scales. In each case, you have to play with the color scales to optimize. And there's a right mouse click normalize, which totally exaggerates the color scale. But what it does is it gives you a much better indication of the pattern. So I was asked yesterday, how many microns thinning is keratoconus? Which is like, no, that's the wrong question. It's nothing to do with how many microns. It's not 1 micron or 5 microns. It's the pattern. It's the pattern. You can have someone with a thick epithelium everywhere, but there is a focal thinning of 1 or 2 microns exactly where the back surface is slightly not right. That's it. Even if the focal thinning is still 56 microns, because the surrounding is 58. It's the abnormal focal thinning that is the diagnostic of the stromal surface bump. So in this case, I'm going to change the color scale, and now I get much more exaggerated pattern. And then I can correlate it to the back surface. Okay? And that is when I say, it's not a good idea to do corneal surgery. And I know that some people think that it's okay to do PRK in virgin eyes when they have form thrust, and that's okay. But I prefer just to say, well, why would I give that person a question mark over their head for the next 10 years? Why don't I just put an ICL in, and then we don't have no more question marks, right? As long as the thing is the right size, it's bulletproof. So for me, it's a kind of a binary decision. It's either you have corneal surgery because I proved you don't have keratoconus with an epithelial map, or you get an ICL. There's no in the middle. And I'm not talking about treating keratoconus, which I'm sure we're going to hear about in a minute. That's totally different. I'm talking about people who come for refractive surgery and have a subclinical keratoconus. They have normal eyes. So I'm going to just show you a couple of examples of, okay, this is obviously a strange topography, although the Atlas algorithm said it was normal. And, it's pretty obvious once you start looking at a back surface that everything's red and it's, it doesn't look good. But I just use this case because it's one of the very first cases when I got the prototype MS39. And the color scale was the other way around. But you see there was that thinning there. And I have a simultaneous ultrasound scan, and we were doing a lot of simultaneous scanning because we needed to see whether this thing was real. And it is real. I mean, we're getting, we have a lot of concordance between the epithelial measurements by OCT and those by ultrasound. And so, this was the old configuration, the way the machine came, and therefore using an epithelial map to correlate it to where the back surface is abnormal, that's the key. Yeah, it's the back surface with the epithelial map. That is the key. So here's a case of a super steep cornea in a 29-year-old with about a -10 total. And normally -10 is perfectly adequate in a thick cornea for doing smiles, and that's not a problem at all. But this is a very steep cornea. And, okay, it's very symmetrical, it's very scary, and the Atlas says it's keratoconus pattern. So, if you're going to do surgery on a cornea where in the medical record it said this is a keratoconus pattern, you have, big cojones, right? So, I have big cojones because I have an epithelial map. And so, that horrible map on the Pentacam, you say, well, you're not going to do LASIK. I mean, well, you're not going to do LASIK. The BAD is 4.3. It's like an Olympic gold medal BAD. Yes, I am going to do LASIK on this patient. I'm going to do SMILE because that epithelium is completely normal. It is not possible for this to be keratoconus. It's not possible. Because if there was a cone this big on the back surface, there would be something on the front surface, and it would have that pattern on the epithelium. So this is a cornea with some endothelial cell dysfunction, so that the cornea is kind of a bit thick, and it's just not quite, it's not Fuchs, but it's just not working right. Yeah. So the detergescence is abnormal. So that is not keratoconus. That's totally different from keratoconus, right? So the algorithm, classifies it as normal. So here's a beautiful early example again. Some of these are not in the format that we use now, but this is an anterior tangential map. This is the posterior map. Again, everything looks fine. It's a sunny day. But this is the epithelial thickness profile. And this is keratoconus. I mean, it's classified, but you can see that relative to the normal population, there is inferior thinning pattern. And that correlates to the inferior, small inferior steepening that we saw on the topography. So I'm just showing you all these marginal cases where that's keratoconus. No, it's not. That's not keratoconus. Yes, it is. And that is the key to our specialty. Because you have these negatives where people did LASIK on these patients, and all of them would have got ectasia. Not with me, because I had an epithelial map. And you also had all of these scary cases where the medical record said suspect keratoconus, and you were like, well, it would be very, very brave of me to do surgery and leave this in the medical record. But I was fine, because I had an epithelial map, and I could prove that it wasn't keratoconus. Yeah? So it's all about the epithelial profile. It's all about the epithelial profile. So before we get, there's no always, there's no never in medicine. And I want to show you exceptions, because you have to always have your clinical hat on. And there are other influences on the epithelium, right? With Jose, we did I think I did a 3-hour lecture on just the epithelium during COVID, remember? So, for example, we all know about contact lens warpage, right? And, the fact is that people say you only need the contact lenses out for 3 days. Well, okay, look what happened. Between 3 days and 2 weeks, the epithelium redistributed itself further. And so the cornea became more symmetrical, and so your astigmatism measurement was different, and so you got a more accurate result, whether you're doing cataract surgery or corneal refractive surgery or an ICL. Basement membrane dystrophy, well, we all had to recognize basement membrane dystrophy on an H&E stain histological slide. The reduplication of the basement membrane, the heaping up of columnar cells in an abnormal way, and that can look like, it can totally look like keratoconus. Well, it's random, right? Likewise, if you have edema of the epithelium, well, then the epithelium is thicker. So you have to think clinically, right? Because there are other reasons for the epithelium to be abnormal. Here's an example of what the Insight 100 classified as a bilateral keratoconic, right? Look at the epithelial profiles. But this is not keratoconus because it is due to the eyelid anatomy of this patient pushing the epithelium down here and creating it, okay? So, I'm going to stop talking about this particular thing that I've talked about nonstop for the last 20 minutes, and I've been saying the same thing over and over again for 20 minutes, okay? You cannot and should not do corneal refractive surgery if you don't have an epithelial map. And that's a very bold thing to say, but it is true. If you're not looking at the epithelium and you're doing corneal surgery, you're wrong in 2021. In 2021, you actually don't have an excuse now. Because if you get ectasia, you will get an expert on the other side saying to you, in the court, let me see the epithelial map. And you say, I don't have one. And then you say, but it's 2021. And those things are all over the market. So you're driving without a seatbelt. There's no airbags in your car. Like, what are you doing? It is almost indefensible, I would say now, given the amount of literature in the peer-reviewed literature. It's just not acceptable to do any corneal surgery without an epithelial map. So, a little bit harsh there, sorry, but there we are. So, let me show you a kind of, just to finish, how another way that I consider this to be an extraordinarily powerful tool. So I had a SMILE, and many of you know, we have a SMILE textbook where we were open kimono, and I published every single complication that I generated during my learning curve of SMILE The textbook is 450 pages, about 200 of that is complications. And he was an interesting one, because I'm not going to go into the details because this is not a SMILE course, but for one reason or other, I created a false plane. And I recognized it during the surgery. A bit late, I would say, but I did recognize it, and I didn't remove the lenticule. So immediately afterwards, what do? I go and bring the patient to the slit lamp of the 21st century. So I want to see what the hell is it, where was I here? So there's the false plane that I was creating, and if I then look at the sections of the B-scan, I could very, very nicely see where the lenticule, which was, obviously cut but not removed, and where I had gone way too far there. And here is the beginning of the false plane, and here is well below the original surface, etc., 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 etc. And so I was able to map the extent of the false plane. And therefore I was able to, in 3 dimensions in my mind, make a plan on how to fix this. So I waited a month, and the patient was now, instead of originally being minus 11, I think, was now minus 25. And that was because this lenticule, in 1 month, still hadn't lost its edema, because it's detached. And there's just, the oncotic forces are not working. And this thing is just an edematous lenticule in the middle of the cornea. And I go through all of the measurements that I made. And of course, we measured this at 272, but we had planned it at 203. So I knew that it was edema, right? Because the diagnostic device enabled me to do that. And I knew that I couldn't. I talked to one expert friend, and he said, oh, just do a circle and then visualize the lenticule and take it out directly. But I said, no, I can't do a circle because I've measured the RST, and the RST is, 240. And I can't do that. I can leave 240 if I have an intact cap, because then the total uncut stroma is 300. But I can't cut a flap and leave 240, technically, although people do. So the decision was made, based on the anatomy, to create a new incision infranasally, and to come in, find the lenticule edge like I would anyway, supratemporally, and avoid going into this false plane again. If I was to come in through here, I might have gone into the false plane again. So I came in from the other side and the procedure took 2 minutes. And I literally, within a couple of minutes, took out the full lenticule, and it was a boy. You can see it's a boy, right? Putting the little finger. So again, the panic was completely dissipated by having the imaging. I had a 4-dimensional microscopy, right? You got your stereo in the microscope, and then suddenly you have that's 3 dimensions. You have a 4th dimension, which is this pachymetric anatomy, and there's the anatomy after removing the lenticule, and here's the before and after, and the difference map, and it was great. So remember that the machine is designed to segment normal epitheliums, and the algorithm, not yet, can find irregular epitheliums very well. So if you have a complicated cornea, you will have to go through and manually edit every single one of those 16 scans. And here's a video of one of my technicians doing just that, and he's not that fast. I mean, this is sped up. I was like, wow. But I mean, eventually we will have, obviously, some kind of software that will be able to do this kind of segmentation. But when you do that, then you can derive a very irregular map. And as you can see, the gold standard high-frequency ultrasound is the same. And so this is a time saver. It's much more convenient for patients. As I say, I have 5 MS39s in my clinic. Okay, I'm not against OCT. I love ultrasound because it does some things that OCT doesn't do. But I do like the fact that I can get an accurate and highly informative diagnosis that I can make from the anatomy. And so I hope that that kind of was a very gentle approach in saying, if you don't have an MS39, you've got to run for the door, because no other device, and no other device does what this device does, because not only is it an anterior segment OCT that resolves the epithelium, but you see the history of this company. This always sounded better when I wasn't a consultant, because then I could say I don't have a financial interest. Now that I'm a consultant, I feel guilty saying this, but it's the truth, okay? No other company has the history of analytic tomography. So these guys have analytic software, which is now benefiting from the layered imaging. So anybody starting with their epithelial maps or topography maps now is starting from scratch on the analytics. You had the Sirius, and all of that software is instantly transferred to epithelial maps and everything else. So currently on the planet, there's nothing even close to this device. Nothing, even close. And I'm sorry for the others, but I hope that that seems scientific enough and not biased. Thank you for your attention.